It's almost afternoon. I'm going to wait just a minute because it's not quite 11:30. Let's see if we have any eyes, as Rhoda says. Hello, I'm Kathleen Kapkara, Lay Associate for Parish Life at Trinity Episcopal Church and Chaplain at Trinity Preschool. All this week, we have been hearing about the life of Jesus. I'm just going to summarize today the early parts of the life of Jesus, but if you want to see the whole story, you can go back and look at some of the previous videos. They'll be up for about 3 weeks. This story is called The Faces of Easter, and it was written by the Reverend Dr. Jerome Berryman, at least 30 years ago. These pictures that we're using were made by one of his students, and they have special meaning for him. You could use different pictures of the faces in this story and still tell the story. The company called Church Publishing owns the rights to this story, and they've given us permission to film it right now. Before we start, I like to ring my singing bowl to get quiet inside. Do you remember? In the beginning, the baby was born. God chose Mary to be the mother of God, and the Word became a wordless child. The mother Mary and the father Joseph held the baby close. They kept the baby warm and gave the baby everything that he needed to grow. But when the baby Jesus looked into the face of the mother Mary, he already saw the cross. And when he looked in the face of the father Joseph, he saw the cross there too. But the baby ate and was warm and began to grow. I'm going to put this light down, this candle, to remind me of this part of the story, because the prophet Isaiah said, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light." He was talking about Jesus. "Those who dwelled in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined." There's darkness in this story today too, but when the baby began to grow, he became a boy. And when he was 13 years old, he went to the temple in Jerusalem with all of the people from his village to celebrate one of the great high holy days. But on the way back, Mary and Joseph lost him. They went back to the temple to look for him. They looked everywhere and finally found him. And he said to them, "Did you not know I would be in my Father's house?" They were confused because Joseph was his father. They didn't know he was talking about God being his father also. I'm putting down a shepherd and his sheep because shepherds always look for their sheep when they get lost. And Mary and Joseph looked for Jesus. Jesus grew to be a man, and when he was 30 years old, he was baptized by his cousin John, who was a wild man. When Jesus came up out of the water, there were people that day who said they saw a dove over the head of Jesus, and they said they heard a voice, the voice of God saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." I'm putting a dove down to remind me of the dove that was over the head of Jesus. When Jesus was baptized, he went back into the desert and was there for 40 days and 40 nights to discover who he really was and what his work was going to be. And while he was there, a voice came to him and tempted him to do the wrong things. The voice asked him to turn bread into stone, stone into bread. and Jesus said no. To be a real human being, it takes more than bread to live. The voice also asked him if he wanted to be a king, and Jesus said, no, I'm going to be a king, but not over the kingdoms of the world. I'm putting down some stones to remind me how the evil one tempted Jesus to turn stones into bread. After Jesus was in the desert, he finally knew what his work was going to be, and he crossed back into and across the river Jordan and began to do his work. He chose 12 friends to help him. Jesus' work was to come close to people, especially people who nobody else wanted to come close to. Look, Jesus is so close to this blind man, he's touching his eyes. When Jesus came close to people, they changed. They could see things they could never see before. They could do things that they could never do before. Jesus loved everyone. I'm putting this heart down to remind me that Jesus loved everyone and came close to people who no one else would come close to. After Jesus did this work, he told many parables. And finally he knew that he had to become a parable. And so he turned toward Jerusalem for the last time. When Jesus went to Jerusalem for the last time, there were crowds of people from different lands. They had come to celebrate the feast of the Passover, and they thought Jesus was coming to be their king. But they weren't paying attention. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, he did not ride on a great white horse like kings would. He was not carried by soldiers. Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, and it wasn't even his. He had borrowed it. But still, when Jesus rode into the city, the crowds waved palm branches, which was a sign of kings. On Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday of that week, Jesus taught in the temple. One time, in the night after he was teaching, Jesus and the 12 disciples, his 12 friends, went to the Mount of Olives and spent the nights there. The people started to whisper because they said the Mount of Olives was where angels were supposed to come down and raise an army to drive out the Roman soldiers. One day when Jesus was teaching in the temple, he said to them, look, there's an old woman coming up. She's going to put money in the collection box, the money box. Listen and hear if you can hear what she put in. You couldn't hear very much. Then Jesus said, look, there's a very rich man coming in. He has so much money to put in the box, people had to help him carry it. Listen. Do you hear that great clanging noise all that money made? Who gave the most? Was it? Some people said it was the woman, because that money she put in was all she had. And some people said that the rich man gave the most. On Thursday, the temple guard said, we will arrest Jesus and take him away. But Thursday, Jesus was nowhere to be found. Jesus and his 12 friends hurried through the dark streets of Jerusalem and went into an upper room to have their last meal together. Look, this is a painting Mr. Da Vinci made of how he thought maybe the Last Supper looked. This is Jesus in the middle of the table with his 12 friends. After they had all that they wanted to eat and to drink, Jesus did something very strange. He took bread and he blessed it. He thanked God for it. And he broke it and he gave it to his friends and said, Whenever you eat the bread and break it and share it, I will be with you." Then Jesus thanked God for a cup of wine, and he shared it with his friends, and he said, "Whenever you're together and share the wine like this, I will be with you." What was he talking about? He was always saying strange things. They did not understand, but someday they would. After they had eaten, Judas suddenly got up and left, but the others stayed and they sang a hymn. Then Jesus and his friends went to the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives because Jesus wanted to pray there. After he was finished praying, he joined the 12 who came out of the darkness, but Judas came from the shadows and greeted Jesus. This was a signal to the temple guards that they could take Jesus away, and they came out of the shadows too. They took Jesus and disappeared into the night, and Jesus' friends scattered into the darkness also. The night was a confusing one. Jesus went on trial, and the next day, Jesus was condemned to death. And they took him on a hill outside the city and nailed him to a cross. The next day, Friday, Jesus died. They took his body off of the cross. It was dark outside, but they put him in a cave and rolled a stone in front of the cave and left. On Saturday, it was so quiet you could almost hear the earth breathing. But it was the women who had the courage to go to the cave to see Jesus, to put special spices on his body. They wanted to see Jesus even if it was very sad. But when they got to the cave with the stone in front of it, they noticed the stone was gone. Jesus had risen. They were amazed. Jesus was somehow still with them, just as Jesus is still with us, especially in the bread and the wine. So, look, we have to change the color. It's the color white, the color of celebration, because Jesus still is with us. But look, this story isn't a line. It has a beginning and a middle and an ending. But the ending is not all there is, because we know that there's a new beginning in the ending. Jesus is still with us, especially in the bread and the wine. We can't have the ending of the story without the beginning, and we can't have this side without this side. So we can't keep the story in a line anymore. It needs to change. Let's see what we can do. The baby that was born, the boy. Jesus being baptized and tempted in the desert and discovering who he was. Jesus coming close to people and making them whole again. Look, now the story can go on forever. Tomorrow is Saturday when The earth will be so quiet you can almost hear it breathing, but then we will have a little vigil of Easter at Trinity Church, streamed live, starting at 8 p.m. And on Sunday, there will be a sunrise service. I will tell one part of the Easter story on Sunday, but it will not be live. You can look at it anytime you want. It will be a short story, but Easter is such a long season that we celebrated for 6 whole Sundays. So there'll be many more parts of the story to hear. Thank you for being with us. Have a blessed Good Friday and a happy Easter.